Hello, everyone. Morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Hi. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on this Saturday morning. We're very, very excited to have you here. My name is Beata America. I'm a curatorial assistant here at Zeitz MOCAA. And I'm going to be your MC for the day. So if you have any questions or queries, you can just stop me and ask. But I'm going to run you through a little bit of the program so you kind of understand the outline for the symposium today. So we're doing the symposium to celebrate a new season of exhibitions here at the museum, particularly two that are on level 4, which is Past Disquiet and Seismography of Struggle Towards a Global History of Critical and Cultural Journals. And both exhibitions explore archival and publishing histories related to resistance, struggle, and solidarity. And this symposium, titled The Politics and Poetics of Archival Practice, is a way of acknowledging these exhibitions as critical curatorial interventions into art historical archives. This moment is for public engagement, aims to create for stakeholders, co-authors, and curators involved to reflect on the multivocal and ongoing significance and importance of these projects. Furthermore, later today, we're also going to be launching our latest publication, which we're very, very excited to be doing, which is the Radical Solidarity, a Reader. It emerged from the proceedings of the Radical Solidarity Summit, which was a week-long online gathering hosted by Zeitz MOCAA in September of 2020. Particularly during COVID-19, the pandemic, with the intention to not only address the urgent issues of the moment, but to explore the alternative futures and possibilities that can be forged in the cultural field through acts of radical solidarity. It retains the conversational, intimate nature of the online gathering, whilst honoring the urgency and complexity of the subject matter. So we're very, very excited to be having that at the end of the day. But today, this morning, we're going to be having remarks by our leader, Koyo Kouoh, and then we're going to be going into our first lecture of the day with the two curators of Past Disquiet, Rasha, Salti, and Kristine Khouri. Followed that, we're going to have a short Q&A, and then a 15-minute break at quarter to 12, apologies. And then at 12 o'clock, we're going to have another lecture by the curator for Seismography of Struggle, 𝘗𝘪𝘴𝘵. Also again, followed by Q&A, and then we'll have a lunch at 1, which will provide you the opportunity, if you haven't been able to see the exhibitions, to go onto level 4 and to see them and use that time to go and explore the shows. After lunch at 2:30, we're going to be having a roundtable discussion moderated by our assistant curator, 𝘗𝘪𝘴𝘵. And then at 4, we'll have the book launch for Radical Solidarity, a Reader. So it's a full day. Take your time, and thank you so much for spending your Saturday with us. We're incredibly excited to have you here. If you are looking for the bathrooms, they are through those doors to the right, but there's a bunch of Zeitz MOCAA staff scattered around today, so you can ask any of us and we will point you in the right direction. Coffee and tea and beverages are also there at your leisure, so please make use of that. We could all use a bit of coffee. Okay, so on to the proceedings. I'm going to introduce Koyo Kouoh, who I'm sure a lot of you already know, but I'll give you the Cliff Notes version if you haven't already know who Koyo is. So Koyo, of course, is our executive director and chief curator here at the museum. She was also the founder of Raw Material Company, and she has organized many, many amazing and timely exhibitions, one of which is When We See Us, which is on level 3, that you can also go see. It's going to be up still for another month. She's also very active in the critical field of the arts community in a Pan-African and international scope. She has a long, incredibly long list of publications under her name, 2 of which you can actually get at our museum shop downstairs, the When We See Us publication, as well as a Radical Solidarity, the Reader later. And during her tenure here at the museum, her curatorial work focused on the in-depth solo exhibitions by African and African descent artists, including Mary Evans, which you can also see on level 1. So We are very, very honored and excited to have Koyo here always. Our guiding light, Koyo, please come say a few words.
Good morning, bonjour. Thank you so much, Beata. I will not be long. I'm just here to say good morning and to welcome you all to this study day. And thank you for indulging and sacrificing your Saturday, a beautiful day, to be here, to think, to feel across the ideas of solidarity and archival practices that are linked to the two exhibitions that we opened on Thursday. I will not be long. I think that I strongly believe in collectivity, and this is what we are trying to infuse here as an institutional practice at Zeitz MOCAA. And all of this will never be possible without an amazing team. And at this point, I really want to thank each and every one. Of course, starting with the curatorial department, the institutional advancement department, the art education department, the operations department, all the people, all the 50 people who make Zeitz MOCAA possible on a daily basis. And for this particular season, we have worked tirelessly over the last 18 months, actually, to bring this to fruition. So it just gives you a sense and scope of what goes into putting together a program like this. I am particularly pleased because I believe that these two exhibitions that we have here currently completely very good, display the level of engagement and political inquiry that we are bringing into our museum making, but also unearthing stories. The story of Past is Quiet that includes 4 very important chapters of internationalism, about artistic solidarity, about exhibition stories are very essential to the narrative of South African political life and art. How can I say it? Art history. So it is also next to it. Seismography of struggle with the work of Zahia Rahmani, which also is an unearthing of fundamental stories that we don't know. And as Africans, I think that we still have to unearth so many stories about ourselves that were told wrong and that we have to correct in our own words. And this is what these two exhibitions also do. The symposium today, as we have taken a habit now to have this a day of study where we come together to think and to understand also and try to unpack ideas that are pertinent to our life and our existence. And the museum is the right place for that because it's the civic space that we think where knowledge production is paramount next to exhibition making. So without further ado, I'll give it back to Beata, and I wish you a very inspiring and enriching and nourishing day today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Koyo. Now I'm going to be introducing our 2 curators in the first lecture for today. Kristine Khouri is an independent researcher and writer whose research focuses on the history of art circulation and infrastructure in the Arab world, and archival practices and dissemination of that. Khouri is a member of the board of the Arab Image Foundation in Beirut, and Rasha Salti is a writer, researcher, and curator of art and film, living and working between Beirut and Berlin. Together, Khouri and Salti are co-founders of the History of Arab Modernities and the Visual Art Study Group, a research platform focused around the social history of art in the Arab world. They co-authored the essay 𝘗𝘪𝘴𝘵 imaginaire, The Promise of Modernity in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Their current project, Past Disquiet, is a long-term research project which began in 2008 and was transformed into a documentary and archival exhibition. Khouri and Salti are the co-editors of the publication Past Disquiet, Artists, International Solidarity and Museums in Exile, which was published in 2018 by the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw. And please help me introduce and give a round of applause to Kristine and Rasha.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming today on Saturday when you could be resting. First, I want to just give a huge, huge thanks to the whole team at Zeitz MOCAA. It's been such a privilege to be able to mount this exhibition here and do research with the team here. So I would like to thank the curatorial department and the production team, and for today especially, everyone who's involved in putting this beautiful symposium together, and the AV team. Thank you so much. So we're going to get started. So I'm hoping that if you've seen the exhibition, this will give you some more insight into ways to view the exhibition. And if you've not, then you'll be downloading a lot of information today. So I'm going to start by speaking about the 4 different collections or museums that are at the core of our research project. The first one that I'm going to speak about is a project that was launched by Chileans and internationals in support of Chile. The first time the notion of a museum in exile emerged was by Chilean exiles who fled for safety after the Pinochet coup d'etat in 1973. But at the origin of the story was in fact a museum of solidarity with the people of Chile. In 1971, after Allende was elected as part of the Popular Unity Front, he launched Operación Verdad, or Operation Truth, to counter a destructive counterfactual campaign launched by the right and extreme right-wing political forces that controlled most of the media in Chile and that instigated capital flight and threatened Chile's economic stability. So the idea to create a museum for the people of Chile, comprising of artworks donated by international artists as a gesture of solidarity with Chilean socialism. So this collection of artworks was managed by the Institute of Latin American Art at the University of Chile, and there was an international committee of artistic solidarity with Chile. Salvador Allende drafted and signed himself a call to artists, and the international committee had actively disseminated it. The committee was international. It included art critics and intellectuals, and was headed by Brazilian critic, curator, and militant Mário Pedrosa, who was in political exile in Chile, fleeing the military dictatorship in Brazil. The Museo de la Solidaridad por Chile was inaugurated on the 17th of May 1972, and its collection was deemed as one of the most compelling at the time. It comprised of almost 600 artworks donated by artists from across the world. On November 11th, 1973, just 2 months to the day after the Chilean military toppled the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende in a violent coup, the army ransacked the Museo de la Solidaridad, destroying and stealing works and claiming the building as offices. After the coup, a number of prominent exiles, including Miriam Contreras, Allende's former secretary, had escaped to Cuba. Mário Pedrosa, José Balmes, and Miguel Rojas Mix, who all fled to Paris, decided to launch a second call for artists to donate work to a new museum. This one was named the International Resistance Museum for Salvador Allende, or the Museo Internacional de Resistencia Salvador Allende. And this was indeed, from what we can see, was conceived as the first museum in exile, which was presented as an itinerant exhibition. Committees oversaw the collections and, of donated artworks, and its exhibition there we go.
That's this.
Yeah. Committees were formed in Paris, Mexico City, Stockholm, Helsinki, Barcelona after the end of the Franco dictatorship in Spain. Through the 70s and 80s, touring exhibitions of these collections took place in Paris, Helsinki, Malaga, Mexico City, Barcelona, Stockholm, among other cities. This initiative brought together dozens of artworks and collections that lived all around the world, and figures like 𝘗𝘪𝘴𝘵 who spoke about it. So here you can see some of the material documentation, pamphlets, and posters of this touring collection. And it was, it's a pretty remarkable project to think about what it took to really put together these collections in cities around the world, and imagine just simply the logistics, separate from the thought of what it meant to build these collections. At a time where certainly there was no email, people were not exactly in the most comfortable circumstances, and really this came from a place that I think is really inspiring, and what became clear to us is that this project truly did inspire other initiatives. So at the core of trying to look at these different collections, Chile is truly at the heart of it, not only as an initiative of this collection, but in fact as the political struggle and the fight that Allende brought forward. In 1990, during the presidency of Patricio Aylwin, the various collections that had been compiled across the world were repatriated, and the Salvador Allende Foundation, instituted by presidential decree, was assigned to its undertaking. This foundation recuperated works in 1990, and the Museo de la Solidaridad Salvador Allende was re-inaugurated. So in fact, sort of the third version of this museum was re-inaugurated at the Fine Arts Palace in Santiago on September 4th, 1991. Today, the director of the museum is Claudia Zaldívar. They're, in fact, still recovering artworks in Chile that belong to the collection, and after years of negotiation, they're compiling further information. So not only are they repatriating kind of the collection itself, but in fact the documents, right? Imagine these documents are really scattered around the world and have been building a really incredible archive.
Next. Should I do this for you? No.
Yeah. In 1980, during a festival in Rome that celebrated the first anniversary of the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua, Ernesto Cardenal, a renowned poet and the Minister of Culture in the new Sandinista government, met Carmen Vall. Carmen was a Chilean gallerist, an arts administrator who played a major role in the museum in exile for Chile. The idea for a museum of solidarity with Nicaragua, or the Nicaraguan people, was born then. Kouoh was asked to spearhead this project, and a year later, an exhibition in support of the Nicaraguan people was inaugurated in Paris, and the same year in Madrid. This collection was in fact a little bit different because the intention was to build a collection of Latin American art, so not specifically a truly international exhibition or collection. And in 1981, so the exhibition was commissioned by the Nicaraguan embassy in Spain when the exhibition happened in Madrid, and they sent out a call for donations, and the show was inaugurated by Spanish poet Rafael Alberti. So they really engaged with Spanish artists and thinkers who were there at that time. So as I said, primarily Latin American artists, a lot of them of course were exiled in Europe, and some Spanish artists donated works to this collection. Many were the same artists who gave work to the collection for Chile. So this is where we start seeing in many ways the links between these collections, not only an initiative, but in fact by those who gave work. 300 artworks were shipped to Nicaragua from France, courtesy of the French Ministry of Culture. And a couple of individuals accompanied these works and then began building what they imagined the museum to be in Managua. At the time, they decided to call it the Museum of Contemporary Latin American Art, I'm translating it, of Managua. And Kouoh had the difficult task of trying to organize and manage the collection in a country that was battling an embargo and where basic amenities were rationed. The collection was stored at the Rue Dario Theater in 1982, and then it was first exhibited to the public. And this is again where eventually the story of this collection shifts throughout the 1980s, and another link is 𝘗𝘪𝘴𝘵, who was involved, the Argentinian writer who was involved not only in the collection for Chile, but also for the collection for Nicaragua. In 1985, they renamed the museum, maybe for the third time, the Museo 𝘗𝘪𝘴𝘵. So you see links in more ways than one between these collections. All right, here we get to the locally relevant story. So The Art Against Apartheid, or Art Contre Apartheid collection, was the initiative of two artists, French artist Ernest 𝘗𝘄𝘃𝘃 and Spanish artist Antonio Saura. Ernest was a member of the Communist Party, and he had met Antonio Saura, who was in exile in Paris from the Franco dictatorship in Spain. 𝘗𝘄𝘃 had been actively engaged in the Brigade Internationale des Peintres Antifascistes, so the International Brigade of anti-fascist painters, which staged an action in solidarity with Greek dock workers who refused to unload South African ships in the port of Athens. Saura had been an active member of the French committee of the Resistance Museum for Salvador Allende. In 1974, during the twinning of Nice and Cape Town as twin cities, Ernest installed his work along the route in which the mayor of Cape Town would have would have kind of driven. So this was, his response as an artist from Nice, as someone who was completely appalled by the fact that these two cities, one of which was under apartheid, were being twinned. Fast forward to a few years later, where the UN's campaign against apartheid was really trying to find a way to engage artists and have a cultural boycott. And that's where Ernest brought forward the idea of not, in fact, specifically doing a boycott, but building a collection. Ernest had given a work to Palestine, which I'll speak about later. He had given a work to Chile. He was involved in the Nicaragua collection. And so this is where sort of the genesis of the story of the Art Against Apartheid collection comes from. So they established an association in France called the Artists of the World Against Apartheid. And they sent a call for artists to donate works, in which they would build a collection and launch a touring exhibition, a mobile exhibition, of showing, in fact, incarnating the international artists' engagement with the struggle to overthrow the regime of apartheid in South Africa. 𝘗𝘄𝘃𝘃 traveled to New York shortly after he set up the committee, where he met with French sculptor Armand, who helped him establish real access to American artists, and he met with organizers of the UN Special Committee Against Apartheid there. In the end, they decided to cap the number of artworks at around 100 or so, and they in fact invited writers to contribute text. So they did not only ask artists to contribute artwork, but in fact text to this collection. The collection traveled to over a dozen countries, probably over 40 cities, and it was a really remarkable tour from about 1983 with its first exhibition to its second to last tour, which was a remarkable tour in Japan, which started in 1988. The travel or tour in Japan was one that was pretty exceptional and something we'd never seen before, and in fact only found out by chance, which is a lot of what happened with this research. When we were doing research in Japan around the Palestinian solidarity, an artist said, "Did you know that there's a collection against apartheid that traveled to Japan?" We said, "We've heard it, we've seen it written or noted that it traveled to Japan." And she handed us the catalog for the exhibition that traveled in Japan, and eventually we were able to get in touch with people who were involved in organizing it. So the tour in Japan lasted for 3 years. It first started in Okinawa, in the southern end of Japan, and eventually reached Tokyo as its final destination. And it traveled to over 197 places for over 3 years, basically, or 2.5 years. And what they did was they were really focused on trying to not host this exhibition in museums, but in fact community spaces, gyms, schools, places where people could truly access this collection and see it. Sometimes the exhibition was up for 1 day, sometimes for 1 week. And what they did to make this possible was, if you really think logistically, what it meant to tour a collection of 100 works was that they designed and built a truck that could store, cool storage, this collection, and different people drove this truck throughout Japan to exhibit this collection and install this collection. It's like something I think we've never seen before. And here you'll see some
red balloon. The red balloon.
Yeah, so here you'll see a couple of images from the catalog. They're very small. You can see them larger in the exhibition. And so at the top of the on the top of the truck was a red balloon, which really was, this was a moment where the intention was really to critique imperialism and colonialism, and the red balloon, taken from, the Japanese flag, also would draw people to the exhibition. So it had multiple functions. In 1990, after Mandela was released, and after 1994, the collection was eventually negotiated to be brought back to South Africa, or brought to South Africa for the first time. And in its due place in 1996, the walls of Parliament, which had been adorned with apartheid art and leaders of apartheid, those works were taken down, and this collection was then put up on display. We were very lucky to meet with Eric Miller, a photographer who in fact documented the process of removing this collection and then putting up this new collection. The collection was not donated to a museum, but in fact was placed in the custody of the 𝘋𝘪𝘴𝘲𝘶𝘪𝘦𝘵 Center at the University of Western Cape, one of the largest archives of liberation struggle materials in the country. And of course, 𝘗𝘪𝘴𝘵𝘲𝘶𝘪𝘦𝘵, then the chair of the Parliamentary Select Committee for Arts and Culture, mediated between the Artists of the World Against Apartheid Committee and the ANC to bring this collection here and find its place. Today, the collection is currently at the center.
Sure. So, and we get to the final or the fourth story of a collection and a museum in solidarity, or intended museum in solidarity in our research. And actually what we did today was not follow the path of our research, how it happened, but our story starts with this exhibition. The International Art Exhibition for Palestine was inaugurated in the basement hall of the Beirut Arab University in Beirut, Lebanon, on March 21st, 1978. The exhibition, which planned to remain open to the public for 2 weeks, was extended until April 25. It was organized by something that was called the Plastic Arts Section, which was part of the Office of Unified Information. This is like the language of the 1970s and revolutionary politics in the Arab world. But basically the PLO was a political movement. It was not a government. And the Unified Information is kind of the equivalent of Ministry of Information. So the exhibition, in the catalog, the text of the woman who was directing the Plastic Arts Section and who is the custodian of this collection, she clearly states that it was intended to be the seed for a future museum in solidarity with Palestine. And like the other collection, it was intended to be itinerant, to demonstrate to the world the support of international artists for the cause, for the Palestinian cause across the world, and was intended to return to Palestine until it was free and democratic. The catalog was a bilingual publication. I mean, we first found out about this exhibition from the catalog. So the catalog was our guide for a very long time throughout the process of our research. It was bilingual in English and in Arabic. It remains the most comprehensive trace of the exhibition. And inside, that's the catalog. That's the cover with the work from Argentinian artist 𝘋𝘪𝘴𝘵𝘲𝘶𝘪𝘦𝘵. And this page, which acknowledges and thanks the people who helped make the exhibition, as well as the next 2 pages that list the artists by country, were basically our Rosetta tablet, like the guide, the foremost guide for us to unearth the story of this exhibition. At the instance of the opening in Beirut, the exhibition hosted approximately 200 works donated by nearly 200 artists from 30 countries. The participating artists produced exhibition posters, as well as the invitation card and the catalog. The director of the Plastic Arts Section, Muna Saudi, was basically the custodian of the collection and of the project. Several artists came to Beirut. This is the typical artist dinner after the opening. Several artists came to Beirut to attend the exhibition, including Claude Lazare, a French artist who played a major role in the putting together of this collection, 2 Italian artists, Paolo Ganna and Bruno Caruso, as well as a Brazilian artist who is based in Paris, Gontran Neto. Gontran Neto was involved, very closely involved in the Museum of Resistance for Salvador Allende in Paris. He was also very involved in the Art Against Apartheid collection. He was part of the board and of the committees, and we see him here. So this is one layer of the connections of these 4 collections, how an idea travels and how actions are transmitted across groups of artists. Arab artists were also present at the exhibition. Some visited the show later, but one of the most prominent was Moroccan artist Mohammed Melihi and Palestinian artist Slimane Mansour, who's one of the more important modern Palestinian artists. He was actually smuggled from the West Bank to Beirut to come and see this show, So, you wanna? Yeah. Over a few years, the collection kept growing, as was evidenced by newspaper articles that we found that acknowledged that artworks were produced by and sent by German and Japanese artists, as well as artists from other nationalities. And then we found exhibition catalogs that show these other works. So the collection traveled to several places. To Japan, 100 artworks. The first travel was to Japan. 100 artworks from the collection went there and were part of an exhibition in Tokyo titled Exhibition for Restoration of Human Beings and Nature, in the same year, 78. It was hosted by an independent arts association known as the Japan Afro-Asian Latin American Artists Association, one of the longest names ever. The acronym JALA is basically what is used most often. The exhibition was up at the Tokyo Metropolitan Art Museum in July 78. One Palestinian artist traveled to accompany the show, Mustafa Al-Hallaj, and he participated in a conference. So we'll get back to these connections in Japan, but the collection also traveled to Oslo and to other cities in Norway in 1981. And finally, or at least for us, for the story, it traveled in early 1982 to Tehran. In 82, the communists were still powerful in Iran after the revolution. They were not yet decimated. Anyway, so the Writers' Union was dominated by the communists, and they hosted parts of the collection as well as several artists to Tehran. In 1982 is a tragic year in Lebanon. The Israeli army had invaded South Lebanon in 78, but they had stopped somewhere on a in the south of the country. In 82, they advanced. The intention was to uproot the PLO from Lebanon. PLO had taken up headquarters in Lebanon. And so they advanced on Beirut, and so the city was under siege, shelling, etc. The airport was closed. So the works that traveled to Tehran stayed in Tehran. And in fact, Kristine traveled to Tehran and found them in the storage of the Museum of Contemporary Art. Sometimes they show some of the artworks, but mostly they've been kept in storage, they've been saved, because in 1982, the artworks or whatever was from the collection in Beirut was placed in a building that was part of this Office of Unified Information in Beirut, and it was hit by shelling. And so we don't know exactly how many artworks survived. What we know is that a couple of artists tried to salvage some works, rescue works from the damaged building. Artworks were placed in the custody of friends of other artists, but 1982 ends with a tragedy. It ends first with the PLO leaving Beirut, with a lot of Palestinian intellectuals and artists leaving Beirut for a long time, and with a massacre, the infamous Sabra and Shatila massacre. So in a way, the fate of the collection remains in the fog of war, hidden in the behind the fog of war. Interestingly, in the past few years, the Palestinian delegation at the UNESCO has undertaken the task of rebuilding a collection. They're not searching for this collection, but rather they sent out a call to artists and have been building a new collection with the ambition to build a museum in solidarity with Palestine. And they're so ambitious that they want the museum to be in Jerusalem. Every year, they show the new donations that they've received, most notably at the Institute of the Arab World, at Institut du Monde Arabe. They do a short but beautiful exhibition of the new additions to the collection is actually quite remarkable. Yeah, so it was important in our research. I mean, I've been saying this since we got here, but basically, if we consider that the collections are the trees, it was important for us to understand the soil in which, from which they emerge. And so to understand whether these exhibitions are exceptional events or whether they are part of practices, how they feature within the lives of the artists that made them possible. In regards to the PLO, we realized that actually the PLO not only had a plastic arts section within the Unified Information Office, and the plastic arts section was mandated to mobilize artists to produce artworks. They also had a film unit. They had a department of national culture and heritage. And these contributed to producing posters. They had an art gallery. They showed exhibitions. In other words, it was important for these institutions and for the PLO to assert that Palestinians exist, because that was the first fight, that we don't exist. And they needed to show that Palestinians existed, that Palestinian artists existed, and that Palestinians have actually existed for quite a while. So yeah, they even produced vinyl records. What's interesting about the mobilization of artists is that in the production of posters is that they did not only appeal to Palestinian artists, they appealed to artists across the world. So for example, the poster in the middle, this one is by an Egyptian artist, and that one by a Syrian Kurdish artist, and so on and so forth. The Palestine Film Unit played a very important role in changing the image of Palestinians. So basically, culture and art were important. The PLO did not have a radio station. It did not have a television station. It could not. They needed to first communicate with their own people who were dispersed as refugees across the region in neighboring countries to Palestine, but also Palestinians in Chile, Palestinians in North America, in Australia. And one of the easiest ways to communicate with a constituency is through the production of posters. They're cheap, and they are very easy to disseminate. They're lightweight. The second point to make was to create a sense of peoplehood, to make sure that Palestinians knew who they are, that they celebrated their heritage. And so posters were useful in that, so were songs, so were poems, novels, and films. The third thing is that Palestinians should, basically the first reaction was Palestinians were refugees. They needed help. They needed aid. So the UN was helping in the establishment of camps, in providing emergency food, shelter, etc. With the PLO, you have a transformation. You have Palestinians that want to say, we are no longer destitute refugees living on handouts. We are now taking our destiny in our own hands. And that is what is referred to as the Palestinian Revolution. And so to show that, you also need films, posters, novels, poems, and songs. One of the really more arresting and important elements in this gamut of production of cultural, creative and cultural outputs is this publishing house called Dar al-Fata al-Arabi, which basically was started by an Egyptian illustrator. And he had the brilliant idea, this idea of a revolution. When it mobilizes artists, they innovate, they give their best. This publishing house wanted to revolutionize pedagogical program and children's education. So they were the first, for example, to have an ecological, basically a sense of environmental consciousness, awareness for ecological issues and gender issues. What they did was they had a very strong graphic identity. The books were either, they were square, either 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters or 20 by 20. And they solicited artists and novelists to write the stories and to illustrate the books. They went to international art fairs. They won prizes. And they were very flexible. So either the books were published as books or as posters. And you see the number of languages. German, Russian, and I think this is Portuguese or Italian. I can't see from here. Okay, next. Okay, you want to take over?
Sure. So kind of coming back to that soil that Rasha was speaking about in terms of where these projects came from and giving context to what was happening in actually, let me see. I think that we need to, I'm going to leave this here. Before we get to that, I want to mention something, and there's a video in the exhibition that kind of goes more into detail around, around this, but is really to mention the role, coming back to the PLO, the role of PLO representatives. So the Palestinians, there were no embassies, obviously properly, that were allowed, but there were representative offices that were often hosted by other embassies or by the Arab League around the world. And what another kind of layer of connections between these collections or initiatives, solidarity collections, and as appeared in the acknowledgements page of the collection or exhibition for Palestine, was the role of PLO's representatives. A number of them at that time really, yeah, a number of them at that time believed that art and culture were part and parcel of trying to win over the hearts and minds of people around the world around the Palestinian struggle and revolution. And so there are a few names that come up in the catalog who we decided to trace, who ended up being very important individuals within the project of this collection being built. The first of which was Azzedine Khalek, who was the PLO's representative in Paris. The second of which was Fethi Abdelhamid, who was the Palestinian representative, the PLO's representative in Japan, who, you know, when we we're lucky to do research in Japan, started to understand what an important role this office in Tokyo played in the in kind of their interactions with a massive movement of solidarity for Palestine in Japan. What we discovered was remarkable numbers of associations and organizations that were doing work around support for Palestine in Japan. And so here you'll see a couple of, if you go back, you'll see a couple of, you know, things. So there are posters for films that were being screened. The office was so vanguard that they in fact produced a publication called Palestine, My Homeland, Palestine Biladi, in Japanese, all written by Japanese, about not only the struggle for free Palestine, but also third world struggles. And it of course only lasted the time in which that representative was posted. After the new representative came, that person did not think that that was an important thing to be doing. And so this kind of archive of these publications of a few years is a really important sort of ephemera, or in fact publication that really should be focused on, I would say. Azzeddine Khalek, who I mentioned, who had been the PLO's representative at the time, he's on the far left in that image. He, in '74, had met exiled Chilean artists who were involved in the collection for Chile, and it was due to, really thanks to 𝘋𝘪𝘴𝘲𝘶𝘪𝘦𝘵, the French artist who became a very dear friend of Azzeddine, who made this link and who had connected Azzeddine to these Chilean exiles. And really the idea of this exhibition, international exhibition in Beirut, became really developed into the idea of building a proper collection.
I don't know if it's, you have to wing it, maybe.
And here, and in Poland and a number of other places, we had a representative who also sort of saw that poster production, which in Poland at the time was a very important form of production. So the PLO's representative in Poland, in fact, developed a call or a competition for posters. And when we had spoken with a few different Polish artists who their posters are quite famous, and Representative Rasha remembers one of them being in your room, right?
Yeah, it was in my bedroom growing up, and I always thought it was a Palestinian artist who was a genius. It was like an incredible poster, and it turns out it's a Polish artist.
And this, if I remember, this poster basically was an envelope addressed to Palestine, and there was a sort of return to sender, no such address, like stamp on that. And so it was a really impactful image and poster that really circulated, and you know, something that we could have never imagined, but they had done this competition for artists to create posters in support of Palestine. And the person who would win, and this was after '82, so the PLO was based in Tunis at that time, the artist who would have won would win a trip essentially to Tunis to produce more work. And a group of Polish artists traveled to Tunis in '85, if I remember, to make posters. And we were able to access, you know, incredible video footage of them painting and making posters and prints in the bathroom in which they were staying.
Of the hotel room.
Of the hotel room. So
And all of this is in the exhibition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just to sort of get a sense of like really how far and what an important role these offices played in acknowledging and knowing how important culture was in cultural production, not only for Palestinians and for Palestinian artists, but really to spread the message around the world.
This is the beginning of UPA.
Yeah, and so the other sort of element as part of the PLO's work in culture was very connected was the Union of Palestinian Artists. So a structure which could support artists, Palestinian artists, to produce work. And what part of unions did at the time was encourage exchange. And so this was an opportunity for Palestinian artists to travel to other places across the world to exhibit their work, and also for non-Palestinian artists to come to Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, to witness properly the Palestinian struggle. And that's really how you see this solidarity emerge and relationships and friendships emerge that 40 years later, in fact, when you remind people or they remember their trip to Lebanon from Germany, have very fond memories and important moments that remain with them, right? That they still think about to this day, 40 years later after their trip. So for example, there was a group of German artists or artists from East German artists who came in '79 and '81 to Lebanon. And we had the opportunity to meet with a couple of them. And so you can, there were photographs, that they still have. And I mentioned this, most of this material comes from private archives. So the histories we're dealing with are not specifically in university archives and institutional archives, but these are stories and histories that remain with people. And if they had the luck or foresight to hold on to these photographs or sketchbooks or documents, in the case of 𝘋𝘪𝘴𝘲𝘶𝘪𝘦, his wife Margot really encouraged him to hold on to these materials. And in fact, when we met him for the first time doing research, and it was for the first few years of research, we had very little material about the exhibition in Palestine, exhibition for Palestine. When we met him, he said, "I've been waiting for you for 30 years." And Claude had these 3 boxes of materials, photographs, press clippings. And so much of the story of the collection for Palestine is really thanks to the foresight of Claude and Margot to hold this, and of course their memories, that hold these histories.
Yeah. So there's the PLO representatives, there's unions of artists, as well as associations of artists that were very active. We spent quite a bit of time researching through Claude Lazare this Association de la Jeune Peinture, a beautiful association that after, based in Paris, that was open to international artists as well as French artists. And after '68, they had become very political. And they embraced causes that were very local regarding the rights of artists, access to space, access to pensions, security, healthcare, but also the struggle against fascism in Spain, Portugal, Chile, the war against Vietnam, and Palestine and apartheid. So they had a salon, a yearly salon in which they showed their work. They produced, these are the catalogs of the salons. They had a bulletin that they also published and distributed. And basically, a lot of them, the catalogs are interesting because they show, especially after '68, that they no longer are interested in individual artists. They're interested in collectives. And the collectives are very loosely formed, so they exist for a few years and then disband, but they're around themes. So anti-fascism, struggles in Latin America, and so on and so forth. I'm going to race through a little bit because I think the concluding section, the sort of self-reflective section, is something that we're really keen on sharing with you. This is a contact sheet from Claude, again from his archive, that show the different documentation of their salon. And this appears in a video. This is a series of photographs. On May 1st, they did a sort of performance in a park in which artists gathered in a circle and raised the banner at the same time. We have still photographs, but it looks very cinematic. Another collective, the Malassi, or the badly seated, like me and you, and they were famous for their unhangings. They produced paintings in series, collectively, and they would be invited to shows, and they were famous for unhanging these series of paintings at shows. And this documents one of their infamous unhangings. Again, the artists were very involved with worker strikes, with immigrant causes. And you see also in the language, the use of languages in the posters. Roberto Matta, a very beautiful and well-known Chilean artist who had an art opening planned, heard about a strike of workers at an aviation plant and decided to move the exhibition to the aviation plant with the striking workers. That's the photo. This is the kind, these are the practices. That's the ecosystem or the universe. Latin America, 4 Latin American artists, including Julio Leparc and Neto. And if you know, Julio Leparc is like one of the masters of optical art, op art. Here you see him producing figurative work. And it was basically based on the reports of released prisoners and militants in Latin America, reports of the torture. Based on the reports, they produced these paintings that depict very graphically the torture, and they used to install, these paintings in public spaces to make sure people knew about them. Collectif Palestine was part of the Jeune Peinture. It's a coming together of Arab artists, but also German and French. So that's one thing that I think we've completely lost nowadays, is how transnational causes, it didn't matter if you were German, you could be part of the Collectif Palestine or French or whatever. What brings you, the gel that brings you together, is the cause. The Collectif Palestine, which basically comprised of Arab, Palestinian, and European artists, produced a 6-meter mural that was used during speeches, and they collaborated with a collective in Italy that basically made exhibitions in public spaces. That's the other like red thread, is artists who believe that art belongs in non-art specific places, belongs in the public space, that art is a way to people's hearts, to talking to them about political change. This is a documentation of a kind of a performance that the Italians, this La Cicoda, this collective of Italian artists, and the Collectif Palestine produced in to raise awareness on a massacre that was happening in Lebanon at the time. So basically, they produced this, like, they reproduced a stencil, and they invited people, a crowd, to gather. They invited them to participate in the making of this stencil drawing, and in the meantime, they talked to them. Okay. Chile. Another kind of a grassroots formation or iteration is basically this story. So sometimes artists organized in collectives, and sometimes they organized in brigades. In Chile, the right wing controlled the media. So for political campaigns, people took over the walls. And they took over the walls by producing murals. And they basically organized themselves like military brigades to produce murals during the night. And so some people, for example, were in charge of sketching, other people of painting the black lines, other people of painting the yellow spaces, and so on and so forth. So that's how they were able to have a presence in the public space. Once the coup d'etat happened and Pinochet took over, the military erased all the murals. And so Chilean exiles took this practice again back to Europe. What you see here is a mural that was being produced at Documenta in 1976. And what you see here is in 1979, I think, in Belgrade, in Yugoslavia, and in Germany on different campuses. But yeah, this is the part that I really wanted to share. And I'll unfortunately race through it because we don't have time. What does our research mean? Of course, we tell stories of how solidarity was manifest in the arts. But also the research and the exhibition. The first thing that they do is they decenter the canons of art history. Generally, when you're taught art history, you're taught Paris was the capital of the art market until the 70s, and then New York took over. So in we did this exercise in the iteration of Past is Quiet in Berlin. We put a map of the world. We put a pin on every city where an event had taken place. And around the semicircle, we listed the events and the year. And then you put a thread. And then you see in this map, that the Cold War, the division of the Cold War between East and West is erased. Things happened as much in Warsaw as they did in Tokyo, in some places in Latin America, in Western Europe, in African cities and Arab cities. The second thing you'll see is there's one pin for New York, and that's at the UN, and a lot of pins for Paris. No, but the point being is that this is when you realize that the art historical canon is so biased towards the market narrative, the narrative of collectors, that basically you cannot even imagine that other maps exist. I'm going to read from my phone because that's where I wrote my notes yesterday. I'm sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So, the fact that we were dealing with histories that have scanned, dispersed, or destroyed archival traces, few of which still exist in institutions, and the fact that we were dealing with a wounded past, a militant production of art attached to struggles of liberation conducted in the framework of exile, implied that we had to rely a great deal on oral testimonies, a number of which could not be fact-checked. A fact that had considerable bearing on how we were writing our own narrative. Furthermore, we were interviewing artists and militants in the moment of the aftermath, after the Pinochet dictatorship was defeated, after apartheid was defeated, after the PLO had created the Palestinian National Authority. This aftermath has its own set of problematics, of unresolved internal conflicts and scars that had not yet healed. And when we were interviewing people, we were actually asking our interlocutors to hearken back to historical moments when hope, aspirations were still vibrant. Those who found themselves marginalized in the aftermath found an opportunity to rewrite themselves in the narratives we were aspiring to write. In the end, our exhibition, Past is Quiet, is an oral history of exhibitions, images, and the production of art. The raw material that we collected, okay, sorry. So the reason we want to show this is because when you show in this contact sheet, what you see is the image that becomes part of some historical record and all the images that don't. And that is why you will find a lot of contact sheets in Past is Quiet. Another aspect is basically historicizing the images and the documents that you see. So, you know, the researcher's impulse is to look at these documents and understand who did what, who is in the photo, who is... But with time, we learn to look at these images differently. For example, it's so bizarre that It's so bizarre that an invitation card should have Japanese and German. And it's so modern and cosmopolitan and international looking. Then why are they making this like backward, traditional, folksy banner? This is how shops advertise their opening in the street. But that's, again, that's the historicizing. They needed to do this to attract people. That's what people do when they open anything. And that is the aspiration of the museum in solidarity that we're doing. Can you? Okay, so this image, as a Dinkalak, PLO cadres, we identified each one of them, and they're looking at a painting by 𝘗𝘓𝘴𝘵. That's one layer. The second layer is you have these conservative men looking at a painting that says sex shop. And it's, you know, what's the conversation? How can we unearth it? How is he explaining to these guys? He was cool, but how is he explaining to these guys that this is an artwork for the liberation of Palestine, sex shop? So great, yeah. That's the work. A third layer of the research. We mentioned names of people who are connected throughout these collections. But the collections are also connected with the images. So that image on top left is from an Italian collective, the Italian collective La Cicoda, an exhibition in a small town in Tuscany. You see that painting, both paintings are by Claude Lazare. And so this painting, he donated to the museum in Chile, and the image on the right, the painting, the sister painting, he donated to the Palestinian collection. And so images, you know, have relationships, tell stories even if the other stories are not told. This drawing, which Kristine showed you from how the Art Against Apartheid collection starts. It's a stencil drawing that Ernest Pignon repeated hundreds of times and placarded along the route in Nice, where the mayor of Cape Town was visiting to celebrate the twinning of Cape Town and Nice. That drawing, Ernest Pignon donates to the Palestinian collection. whether we wanted to create, whether we wanted to see connections or not, they were there also in the images, not only in people.
And I think just maybe to add to that is when you think about, you know, each collection has remarkably different kinds of works, and I think different people hearing historically have different reactions as to what they expect or hope to be part of these collections in terms of, you know, these collections primarily the artists are choosing the work that they decide to give to the cause, right? They choose the work, they were asked to give a work in support of Palestine or in support of Nicaragua or against apartheid. To try to even imagine what the conversations were, if there were, or when they were, between the organizers and the artists themselves, is something that I think is worth trying to have a fiction around, but even to come back to to thinking about the relationship of not only the links between these collections in their thought of what they were meant to be, but in fact, the links obviously between these political struggles. So the fact that Claude gave a work about Palestine to a collection for Chile, the fact that Ernest gave a work about apartheid to Palestine links these struggles in multiple ways.
Absolutely. And the other thing is that you notice, yeah.
We're done. We don't have time.
Oh, we're done.
So no,
we're
maybe
done.
Finish up. Finish up.
Okay.
Finish up, I'm saying. We're,
Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. So the other thing you like, the self-reflection that happens is the circulation of images. Artists like Claude Lazare in Beirut made a painting, an arm carrying a Kalashnikov with a kufiya and barbed wire. Excellent. And he showed it and he displayed it in an exhibition with other local artists. That painting becomes a poster. This free circulation of images, which you see here, book cover, painting, poster, that free circulation of images is something that we've lost. These images were intended to create a visual political imaginary. Now, the flow of images is so tightly regimented with copyright laws. I'm sure I'm all for artists protecting the rights to the representation and circulation of their artwork. But it was wonderful to see how the freedom with which images circulated. And it's an opportunity to salute Judy Seidman, who's here. We're very proud that she's here. And the legacy of the Medu Art Ensemble, because they understood that the legacy, the visual heritage of struggle that the Medu Art Ensemble produced, they have gone through incredible effort to digitize it. It's one of the best ways to transmit that memory, to preserve that legacy and make sure that generations have access to it. And they've inscribed it in the Creative Commons circulation, which means that their images, although they are artworks, they're not regimented as tightly as other images, other legacies of other struggles are. So, and you see further circulation of this image, and voila. Another layer, self-reflexive layer of what our research does is you end up with images that are very rare in art history today. So images of very well-known, very individual artists with their singular practice and identity coming together to produce one work. And that one work is a banner. Whether they are Chileans with Germans and non-Chileans in documenta, like the Paradigm. Whether they are in Paris in a studio producing a banner for Cambodia and against the Centre Pompidou. These are images of assembly, images of community making. Yeah, this is in Venice. And it's important. Art can produce communities. Yeah, further, yeah, more of the images of assembly. Going back to the incredible example of the Art Against Apartheid tour, this focus on, first of all, creating a financial model that makes the tour of a very valuable collection affordable, to make sure that people don't have to pay tickets. So they address prefectures and municipalities, and they agree on a number of tickets per day or a number of days. And the fact of insisting on non-art specific places, because the museums come with a sort of expectation of cultural capital. Two more images and that's it. So this is the sketchbook of an East German artist. And when we were researching, so basically international solidarity in the context of the Cold War. In Western Europe, in the Western world, it was a grassroots story. Association of artists, student union, association of whatever, militants, come together with artists and they produce things from the grassroots up. In the East, in the Soviet-dominated world, solidarity was foreign policy. It was imposed top-down. And so a lot of the art historians of that region from that time, when we ask them about solidarity with Chile, with Palestine, with South Africa, with the struggle against apartheid, they say, you know, artists may have donated. They don't even know whether that their works were donated. They had no freedom of movement. They had no say. And basically, it was like a reward system. The more compliant you were with government policy, the more you were given benefits. So if you donate artworks to the Artist Association and they decide to donate it to this and that, you're not even informed. Okay? And we interviewed artists in Poland and in East Germany, former East Germany, and found it was actually mostly true, except for this guy. So, and I say except for this guy, and I'm wrong. I can't say except for, because I don't know how many exceptions there are. But the point is that with Günter Rechner and his sketchbooks, we understood that you cannot create a blanket narrative that actually so Günter went to Beirut. He had a blast. He said he'd never drank more whiskey in his entire life, as he did in those few weeks in Beirut. But his sketchbooks, he spent time with artists. He spent time with artists, he made portraits of them. There are so few portraits of Mustafa Hallaj, who died in his studio burning. There's so few traces of Seta Manoukian's paintings that were destroyed. And so his sketchbooks, which are in Cottbus in Germany today, are actually the last remaining traces, an archive of a life, of works, of encounters. He had a portrait. It appeared, there was a portrait of a man dressed in a kufiya, al-sharab. And we thought, oh, who's this man? Did you meet this like older Palestinian guy in a camp? And he said, no, this is me. So he made a self-portrait of himself as a Palestinian. This was certainly not part of the program. The program in those places was you can empathize, you show your support, but you're here and they're there. Yeah. Okay. Complicated image. When we were organizing the exhibition in Germany and in Beirut, we felt safe. We could show this image in Beirut because people in their collective memory understand that a man carrying a Kalashnikov does not mean that we are gun crazy. That we have a kind of a distance with this. But in Germany, where, you know, Arabs, Palestinians, Muslims, whatever, can be still regarded as terrorists, as gun-loving, So we were very yeah, we showed this image, of course. We didn't censor it, but we didn't show it as big as we do here or as we do in Beirut. And that's the form of like, how do you historicize images? How do you look at those images and how do you present them today? But the image itself is so odd also. A freedom fighter looking at a painting done by a Frenchman of a gun. Of course, the gun was a symbol. We had no idea what to think. I mean, Tina Kampt writes a lot about listening to images. And so we tried to imagine the audio, the sound behind this image. And it so happens that there was an interview that was being conducted exactly at that moment. And the journalist writes that as the interview is happening and the international artists are speaking, a young freedom fighter comes and stares at a painting. And so she turns to him and she says, "How do you feel? What do you think?" And he says, "Well, I was on the battlefield. Today is my day off. I heard about this exhibition. I came running because this exhibition means a lot to me because it shows that we're not barbaric, that we're not backward, that we know art and culture and the world and artists understand us." Yeah, how do you show those images? Yeah. In this, like the artist and the freedom fighters. Claude showed in the photo behind, I mean, the artists who came to Beirut, they wanted to meet the fighters. So in the photo on the bottom, they went down south to the front and gave them copies of the exhibition catalog. And to them, it was their way of fighting. It was their contribution to the struggle.
Maybe should I end on this?
Yeah, end on this.
I'm going to end on this so you can comment. I know we're beyond time. Maybe just this is the last image, and it's an image you'll see in the exhibition. But this is a photograph of an artwork that's in the exhibition that you'll see downstairs. But it's a photograph from the exhibition in Beirut in 1978. And when we first saw it, it didn't really make that much sense to us. Eventually we realized, and the photograph was taken by Claude Lazare, this is a photograph of an artwork in the show. You'll see another version of it without the reflection. That is by a French artist, 𝘗𝘪𝘴𝘵, with a mirror. And in this image you see, I mean, it was part of his murder series. And this eventually, you know, years into doing the research, we started looking at this image very differently because we realized that this was an image of a future event. Izzedine was, as other PLO representatives, were targets. And in fact, Izzedine was in Lebanon. He was asked by Arafat to come to Lebanon because he was the kind of person who did not want to have protection. He refused to carry a gun. He refused to have bodyguards. And PLO representatives were targets. And in fact, many of them had been assassinated, especially in the 1970s. And so he came to Beirut ahead of the exhibition. He stayed for 6 months and then eventually decided to go back to Paris. But he was told, you know, if you go back, we can't protect you if you refuse to have bodyguards, if you refuse to carry a weapon. And he really did not believe that guns were the answer to the fight. And in fact, this is an image of a future event. Izzedine was in fact assassinated in his office just a couple of days after he returned to Paris. And so I will end with this quote that we refer to by a neurologist, which is really about memory and bringing history back, is that people die 3 times. The first time when their heart stops beating, the second time when they're buried underground, and the third time when no one ever says their name again. And the intention really with this project is to bring back the names of peoples that have not been written into history or have not been properly written into history or have not been remembered as they should be remembered. And so, we mentioned that at times that we feel that there are ghosts leading us through this project. Izzedine is one of those ghosts. And I think that this is a really, maybe a good image to end on in terms of really trying to think about not only what happens in an image, but what an image can tell you about the future.
Sorry for going over time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rasha and Kristine. That was incredibly insightful, and I'd like to open the floor up to any questions, if anyone has any. Now is your time. Okay, yeah, we have one there at the back.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask the power of the funding agents behind exhibitions. To what extent do they guide the outcomes of the exhibitions? Number one, and then I think you answered it, or you sort of half answered it, about when the artists donate works, to what extent are they really donating towards the cause, or are they just taking the opportunity to get into a catalogue or to be aligned with liberal, extremist sort of exhibitions that give them a reputation, maybe? And alongside the tours of these exhibitions, I imagine there are counter exhibitions or efforts from the authoritative bodies, and if one align those with these exhibitions, who wins the war?
I'll answer the question about funding. The Art Against Apartheid exhibition received, it had some support from the UN, but one of the ways it generated funds to survive, to be able to travel, etc., was to produce a mini version of 15 artworks that were reproduced as posters. And these posters were sold, and the revenue was, used for that. Usually institutions that hosted the exhibition paid for it. So we only know of one case where an institution that hosted the exhibition meddled with it, and it was in Korea. It was also at the time of the military dictatorship in Korea. So the Japanese group that hosted the Art Against Apartheid in Japan really was interested in using the exhibition as a prompt to talk about Japan's colonial past. And so for them, it was symbolically very important that it should go to Korea after Japan. So they sent the exhibition to Korea. Unfortunately, at the Seoul Art Center at the time, something like 35 artworks are censored and several texts are not translated to Korean. In the case of...
and the name changes.
And the name changes.
And they eliminate apartheid from the name of this exhibition.
Yeah, and there's a document in the exhibition that basically tells that story. In other cases, at least in the case of the PLO, it was the PLO funding, and nobody ever mentioned the PLO intervening or saying this is not right, etc. In fact, there's a funny discussion between the international artists who were invited to come to Beirut. There was a funny conversation between them. They disagree between them what is revolutionary art and what is appropriate to the Palestinian people, and some of them thought that some artists were not political enough, etc. So it was more a discussion among the international artists than between funders or the bodies, the institutional bodies supporting these exhibitions. And your question about artists and their motivation, we spent a lot of time to talk about the context and the collectives and their practices, precisely to show that the gesture of donating artwork was part of a universe. It was consistent with the way they engaged with politics. They produced posters, they went to rallies. Some of these artists even would go to stand with striking workers. So I don't think that the motivation might have been we have plenty of reasons to be cynical, and we were debunked every time. Yeah. You want to answer the question about the counter exhibitions?
Yeah, I think there's one document that that you'll see in one room that refers to a sort of separate exhibition in support of the Lebanese and Palestinian people in Paris in the it was in the late 60s?
No, early 70s.
Early 70s.
Yeah.
And then in the same newspaper article, there's also an exhibition in support of Israel. So you kind of saw this much space dedicated to the exhibition about Palestine and this much more dedicated to an exhibition of artwork being sold in support of the state of Israel. That was maybe the one instance, and it was not even related specifically to the core stories that we're speaking about, but it happened to be something that we learned of. Were there a lot of counter exhibitions in response to this? For example, seeing I don't believe there could be a counter exhibition in Lebanon against the Palestinian, against this sort of a collection in Lebanon. I don't think that we're aware of any where people responded to these shows by doing counter shows. Maybe, those stories of people who were not on that, sort of stood on that political line, maybe responded more in the press, but not that we're aware of.
Okay, thank you. Okay, yep. So sorry, we just gotta give other people also a chance. We only have a short, limited amount of time. So sorry, if we can have the next question as well. I think there was one over here. There was one over here, and then Koyo, you can go after.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that beautiful presentation and a really extraordinary show. And not only because of what you've amassed as historians, but also because of this vision of a kind of internationalism that is so needed now, in a way, and the politics of solidarity is so powerful. So in that project, what strikes me, in addition to that, is, of course, what you yourselves have said is the complete absence of women. It is an entirely male world that we see here. And I wondered to what extent that was a challenge for you as historians, and where you would look for women's voices as another kind of counter-archive to complement the stories that you tell so beautifully.
Well, maybe I can start with, in the case for the collection for Palestine, the director of the plastic art section was a woman, a Jordanian woman, an artist named Mona Saudi. So in fact, the person, in the case of the Palestinian collection, one of the major figures was in fact a female artist. And in the case of organizing the different collections, like for Chile, you had women who headed, there were men, of course, but Carmen Val was one of the very important individuals who helped organize it. But it was...
Yeah, it was a man's world. It was a man's world, unashamedly so. And so the women that Kristine mentioned are very powerful women who had to fight and shout to stand in that man's world. I think, I think at some point we will have to address the absence of women, or even the fact that their voice is smaller, but so, maybe some power up there exists and has a tremendous sense of irony, right? So Margot Lazare is the one who pushed Claude to safeguard his archive. Judy is here. We are women. So somehow the work of transmission and memory and rewriting history is done by women at the hands of women, and that's why I'm saying he has a sense of irony. It's complicated, but that's the thing. Like, you need, when you look at these documents, at these photographs, you need to think historically, and you need to prompt thinking into the present in discrete ways, without being didactic or propagandist. But these histories are relevant for us today, I think, for our struggle as women, LGBTQ, racialized communities, etc. They are not only relevant for national causes. They're relevant for us, for other causes.
And maybe to add one little story, I remember when we had it was after the fact, but we had interviewed 𝘋𝘪𝘴𝘵 Neto, this Brazilian artist who is a part of all these projects, and especially the Art Against Apartheid collection. And I remember speaking to his son later, and he said, my mother was so involved in this project. She was doing so much work for the Art Against Apartheid collection, but we don't see her name anywhere, right? So sometimes you have to, you know, a child remembers actually what may have happened or is able to, so really trying to think about different ways, or if there happens to be, you know, a family member who remembers that history and is able to tell those stories of, you know, someone else, of the women who maybe were involved and played roles which, you know, maybe a document would not remember, or a person, as they remember, you know, for various reasons, their own memory of that moment gets, you know, eliminated, you know, inadvertently.
Okay, thank you. I think, okay, one more question for Koyo, and then in the interest of time, I think we're going to take a short break.
Yeah, but it's okay. Thank you so much. We can also take a little bit longer time. That's okay. This conversation is important, and we don't want to abruptly stop it. What I would like to ask you, which, considering that we've known each other for so long, I never thought about it. It's actually to seeing the show again now and looking at the images, and particularly looking at the listings and maps, that something dawned on me, and which is actually quite intriguing. And I don't want to ask a difficult question, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think it's a very interesting conversation that we should have. Considering that we are talking the mid-1970s, and that all this kind of solidarity movement, working with art, were very much also somehow triggered by the protests against the Vietnam War, right? We are aware of that. And considering that, if you think historically, you have to put yourself in a time, in a context where the African countries were just liberated by 10 years, 15 years. Many by then was even still under colonial rule. And I am very surprised, just as surprised by the absence of women, I'm very surprised by the absence of the contribution of African artists. And I would suggest that maybe they were not even consulted to be part of this. And why? And these are the kind of challenges that archival research poses, you know, or kind of unearthing. You sort of hinted at it earlier about they are there and we are here. And considering that the large majority of African countries are pro-PLO, are pro-Palestine in many ways, and lots of PLO offices across the continent. So, during apartheid time, the African countries have massively contributed to the liberation struggle just by having ANC offices and providing freedom fighters asylum. So, and this counts for the continent, but also for Southeast Asia, right? So how did you think into it, why these areas are absent in this amazing, liberation movement with art?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we don't, we have like limited space, but Ezzeddine Kalak was in contact with Guinean, he flew to Guinea officially in the name of the PLO, and he spent time in Ghana. We have photos of him in Guinea and in Ghana. He was assassinated in '78. So the story ends in '78 with Ezzeddine, and in 1982, the PLO had nowhere to go. Part of them were in Tunis, part of them were in Algeria, part of them were in Yemen. The point being is that this effort of building solidarity stops. They are out of breath, they are out of funds, and they're just figuring out their bearings. This is '82. By '88, there is the process for the Oslo peace process starts. So yes, we asked ourselves, where are the African artists? And they could have come across them in Paris, they could have come across them in Europe, in Eastern Europe mostly, more so than in Western Europe. And what happened, what did he do in Guinea and Ghana? We don't have traces.
Yeah, particularly when you look at it in the context of Festman 66 and Festac 77, there were so many, artists there, present. I just want to ask, particularly if you placed it under the context of Senghor opening the first West African ANC office in Dakar, almost right after he became president in Senegal, and organizing Festman in 66 and Festac in 77. Obasanjo in Nigeria basically opening a whole department with considerable funds for the fight against apartheid in Nigeria. So, I mean, it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by that.
Yeah.
I think maybe to add is, when you try to think of these constellations, I mean, if you see the archives or the materials or stories that are not present in the exhibition, it's like 3 more exhibitions. And I think that's where the challenge of how do you, for the context of this exhibition, how do you try to tell a story that draws out the links and starts making those connections? And at what point do you have to stop or take a moment? Because even just telling the story of, forget the arts, just solidarity with a cause in a country, that's not, we can hint at that in a few places, but we can't, we haven't had the opportunity to, or we can't within the context of this project tell properly that story. And I think that that deserves its own space, its own history, and by historians who already have done this kind of work, right, and looking at those connections that exist. And so we really trying to bring back to the links between these 4 different initiatives, we hope serves as a starting point to try to imagine and start making further links beyond what the other connections, are and can be.
And that's why it was so amazing that the museum, your museum, could fund and support in adding these 2 chapters on basically the networks of the grassroots of artists engaged in struggle. I mean, the story of the Botswana Festival, I mean, I can't wait.
It was load shedding. Sorry. The generator will kick in 2 seconds.
And another minor change but it's in the room, in one of the rooms, we decide to go all out and
Sure. Yeah.